The Empire called their central archive the Hall of Certainty, and meant it. Under
System
a vault
failure.
of quiet light,
Records
in a
corrected.
chamber so large that sound seemed to hesitate before crossing it, the Empire's memory breathed. Oceans of glass stacked like frozen waves, lattice of data inscribed with the births of suns and the deaths of kingdoms, the yields of harvests, the angles of orbits, the number of teeth in the skulls of extinct beasts. If it existed, they had recorded it. If it had been recorded, it could be predicted. If it could be predicted, it could be ruled. Admiral Varen had built his career on that promise. He stood at the balcony rim, gloved hands folded behind him, watching the shoals of memory architects drift between the columns, trailing skeins of white light that updated themselves as they moved. At this hour, on Archivum Prime, the Hall of Certainty was never loud. It hummed with the restrained confidence of a machine that has never once failed to start. Varen preferred it to the parade fields and victory halls. Here, the Empire was honest about what it truly worshipped. "Status," he said, not turning his head. Prefect Saratal, his intelligence adjutant, materialized at his side with the ghost quiet of someone used to moving among secrets. Morning sweep complete. Discrepancies within the acceptable variants, 17 border incidents, resolved overnight. 2 new species identified on the eastern periphery, both compliant. Jump lanes through the Perseus corridor cleared. The Courier Guild's report schedules restored. Vera nodded, gaze on the moving constellations of data. And the Orion Spur. Quiet as a nursery, Sira said, and would have said more, if not for the small, discordant sound that bloomed behind them, chime out of tune. For an instant it was nothing, a note clipped too early. Then it came again, a descending triad like a sigh, echoing through the vaults. Around them, white skeins stuttered. Far below, a procession of architects stopped mid-stride, soft shoes squeaking against the stone as they lifted their heads as, 1. The Hall of Certainty did not tolerate ungainly sounds. The sound had come anyway. Varen did not move. He had learned long ago that motion was contagious in a crisis. "Explain," a junior architect, his robe still too new to drape properly, jogged to them with the careful speed of someone crossing consecrated ground. He stopped a respectful 2 paces from Varen and bowed. "My Lord Admiral, a misalignment." Sira's mouth tightened. "Use the vocabulary of your craft." The architect swallowed. "An origin drift. We registered a broadcast at the rim. Of the spur, when indexed against the atlas, the origin point resolves to null. No index, no prior entry, no designator assigned." The words fell politely, as if hoping to be mistaken. Varen allowed himself a slow breath. The Empire had words for every kind of anomaly. Ghost, echo, synthesis loop, feedback bloom, relic bleed. He knew them, and the ratios at which they became dangerous. A machine ghost. He glanced at the glowing air. "How many arrays confirm?" The architect glanced at his slate. 7, my lord. 3 courier arrays, 2 long-range surveyors, 1 military relay at Kandala's reach, and a civilian array at the spur's inward lobe. Cross-correlation at 96%. 96 too high to dismiss, too low to relax into. Sero extended a hand. The architect projected the data into the air. A thin blue line reaching from nothing to nothing, marked only by time and amplitude. The origin coordinates did not resolve. The atlas's crystalline geometry, which prided itself on snapping into place with the satisfaction of a lock descending, refused to catch. Varen looked longer than he needed to communicate calm. Then he turned to Sira. "Is the atlas compromised?" "No." Sira's eyes moved in tiny exact motions as she read invisible overlays. Checksum intact. No unsanctioned writes in the last 9 cycles. The atlas has not been touched. "Then this is a new entry." Varen let the words sit. New entries were welcomed every day in the hall. A river measured, a ritual catalogued, a minor dialect appended. But those entries arrived through doors the Empire had built, conquered observatories, compliant species, loyal guilds. They did not arrive from nowhere, assign a temporary designator. The architect looked as if he had rehearsed that answer, and found it had melted. The system rejects any designator assignment without an anchor. The rule exists to prevent corruption from self-referential entries. My lord, the Atlas insists this object does not exist. Sira breathed out, a sound almost like amusement and nothing like it, and yet it is making noise. They moved to a private dais that floated out over the depths, where the hall's systems indulged in Data's theatrics. Above them, a hala. Unfurled, the spur's star fields curled in slow rotation, filaments of dust traced by surveyors, the distant gleam of colonnaded stations along the jump lanes. Through it all threaded a faint, jittering trace, like a hairline crack in polished stone. The signal was not loud. It did not need to be. Varan let the Admiralty's axioms rise in his mind, as they had risen every day since his cadet years. It exists, we have recorded it. If we have recorded it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can rule it. He had recited those lines beneath banners and execution beams. He had signed orders with those lines humming under his skin. To doubt them now would be to take a knife to the tendons that moved the Empire's hand. Other possibilities, he said evenly, a rebel's prank, an enemy's feint. A statistical fluke pushed through multiple arrays by an unlikely breeze. Sira's mouth twitched. A breeze that colludes across 7 sealed systems with unique failure modes and chooses the busiest corridor to announce itself. She angled her head, respectful, even in disagreement. Admiral, we have seen all the tricks. This feels new. He did not rebuke her. Sira's gift her disloyalty to comforting explanations was the reason he kept her. What is the content? Garbled, the architect said. Not encryption. Exactly, not art either. An index of references we cannot anchor. Numbers, proper names, wavelengths. Joke, if I am reading the structure, it speaks as though we should understand it, as though we already do. The joke lodged like a splinter. He imagined a voice, light and human and unafraid, addressing the Empire in its own house. He dismissed. The image, such images, bred carelessness. Triangulate, Varen said. I want the best estimate for its true origin. Use the Courier Guild's raw feeds. Their tendencies to decorate their transmissions with filigree can be filtered. Then, I want an independent calculation from the Kendala military relay. No shared constants. If the 2 points converge within 5 standard deviations, we assume reality. And if they do not, Sira asked, then we assume someone wants us to think it is reality, which is a flavor of reality I prefer less. He stepped closer to the hala. The spur turned. He'd fought there twice once to break a smuggling cartel that had begun believing in its own folklore. Once to dismantle a coalition of minor polities whose sin had been coordinating without asking. The maps then had been immaculate, as if the Empire had carved the lanes into the light itself. Admiral Sarah said quietly, we are broadcasting back. He looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching. Standard procedure, she said, a half explanation. We send a handshake to anything that looks like contact. Polite, precise, unmistakable. It informs the sender that they are now seen. Varen felt the flat warmth of anger bloom and recede. Cancel it. It already went, Sarah said. They watched the handshake 3 tones resolved into a lattice move along the lanes toward the emptiness. It reached the thin, jittering trace, kissed it, vanished into the null. For 3 heartbeats, the Hall of Certainty listened, and the Empire held very still. A reply came immediately. Not louder, not clearer, but with a timing that implied attention. The hall's lights dropped, the way rooms dim when someone tells a story. The returning pulse slid through layers of filtration, broke into pieces, recombined. The architect's hands moved. Ciro leaned over the dais. Varen kept his face neutral, and thought, without wanting to, of a time when the Empire had last been surprised. He had been a lieutenant then, a clever man with the arrogance of a younger age, watching the Ministry of History relabel a lost fleet as purposefully redistributed. The Empire never tolerated holes. It paved them with new names. The architect spoke in a small voice. It addressed us by our honorifics. Show me, Varan said. The hala filled with symbols, not theirs, but made to be easily devoured by any indexer. The translation engine stepped forward, confident as a host. The words formed, careful and almost kind, to the archive of certainty. Hello, we could not find you either, Sira exhaled. A sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any air. The architect made the sign people made when they feared. blasphemy and hoped not to be seen making it, Varen found himself imagining, against his will, a city unknown to the Atlas, with markets and factories and schoolyards, with people who joked about bureaucracy and made plans while their tea cooled. He imagined them not seeing the Empire because they had never been taught to look for it. For the first time that morning, he did not feel the high ceiling of the hall over him. He felt space, the cold and radiant kind. "Assign a response team," he said. Each word weighed. "Scouts, a diplomatic courier. 2 warships still in their skins, not to frighten, to remind." "We are not a rumor." Sarah nodded, already moving in 3 directions at once, speaking in clipped phrases into channels the public would never learn existed. "We'll take the 3rd recon from the Perseus corridor. Captain Jor at Kandala is sober. I trust his eyes. Tell them to record everything," Varen said. He turned back to the Hala. The joke and the pulsive joke, it was still prickled. "We could not find you either." He could imagine the argument from the more imaginative wings of the Ministry, 2 empires. Adjacent not in space, but in story, each schoolchild taught that theirs was the only narrative. Nonsense. The Atlas was not a collection of beliefs. It was a machinery for measuring the world. His hands knew the weight of its levers. Sira, again, softer. He looked at her. "What do we call it?" she asked. It was a bureaucrat's question, and a poet's. The file needs a name. Across the depths, the Empire's memory flowed on, the architects tending it like a garden. That thought, the origin point, still refused to take shape. The jittering trace flickered, as if amused. Varen thought of the axioms, and the emptiness where a designator should sit. A good name would trap the thing, tie it to the great indices. "Reduced chance to a pinned specimen," he said. "Until we can place it, it is a blind notation." He tasted the phrase, "BN1, Sarah entered it." The hall accepted the token reluctantly. Like a dog forced to swallow a pill, "Tell the 3rd recon they are to go fast and come back faster," Varen said. "We will not invite fanciful stories to fill the gap while we wait." He dismissed the architect and remained on the balcony when Sarah left to carve orders into the long muscles of the Empire. He watched the Hall of Certainty flex and settle, and tried to wedge this morning into a familiar shape. In the lower stacks, a line of apprentice archivists made their rounds, placing seals on new entries, affixing the imperial sigil to berths and latitudes. Their movements soothed him. A machine that had always started would start again. From far below, like a confession trying to escape a throat, the discordant chime sounded once more. Varen's expression did not change. He had learned long ago that the Empire's face must be a mirror. The world should see itself calm in it. Behind his calm, the Admiral allowed himself one private concession, a memory of the lost fleet and its neat new label. He had believed the label then, because it was easier to drive a ship. Through renamed waters, he told himself, as he had told himself for years, that names changed nothing but the temperature of the room. He did not know yet that the room itself had shifted. On a distant yard, a warship's skins were peeled back and resealed. On a courier's spine, new engines shivered as they learned their tolerances. In the barracks of 3rd Recon, pilots checked their harnesses and made little jokes to keep their hands from shaking. Somewhere beyond the known lanes, in a system that did not exist on any map Varen had read, someone smiled and sent another, pulsed into the dark. Not with malice, but with the crisp curiosity of people who had spent centuries looking outward and had finally felt another gaze looking back in the Hall of Certainty. The Atlas rejected 2 more attempts to assign a proper designator. Varen did not hear those rejections. He had already turned to go, intent on the business that kept empires true to themselves, moving pieces into position, writing orders that wrapped around possibilities and squeezed until they confessed. His boots made no sound on the stone. He left the hall as he had entered it, a man on a balcony stepping into a corridor, certain of his place in the story. He would be back before the day was out. The hall would be waiting, humming its prayer. If it exists, we have recorded it. If we have recorded it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can rule it. Far away, the universe smiled to itself and did not bow. The courier vigilant thought slid through the void with 2 frigates at its flanks, their drives firing in crisp mathematical bursts that reflected the Empire's obsession with precision. To any observer, they were nothing more than lines of geometry drawn across black space, tools of inevitability. Inside the command deck, Captain Jor stood on the raised dais, eyes locked on the projection that bloomed before him. The Orion spur glittered with veils of dust and gas, stars burning with the cold beauty of fires seen through a haze, but Jor cared little for aesthetics. His gaze was fixed on the anomaly, the signal that had shaken the Hall of Certainty and dragged him from the comfort of protocol into uncertainty. "Report," he said, his voice a measured command that carried the weight of empire. Ensign Yill's fingers flickered across her console, her face illuminated by shifting lights. Her breath quickened, but her tone remained respectful. "Captain, convergence achieved. The source lies within a G-type system, third planet from its sun. Atmosphere rich in oxygen, water signatures strong, biosigns undeniable. The transmissions are originating from the surface." She hesitated, eyes narrowing as the data cascaded. "But, sir, it isn't a single transmission. It's thousands, tens of thousands, broadcasting across multiple spectra radio, microwave, even laser bursts. It's not a beacon. It's an entire civilization speaking at once." A murmur rippled across the deck. Lieutenant Wren leaned forward, his posture sharp, his jaw clenched. "That density can't exist outside a core homeworld. Even compliant civilizations barely approach such saturation. Unless," he paused, as though voicing the thought might summon blasphemy, "unless it is their homeworld." The word struck the crew with the weight of heresy. Every homeworld had been logged. Every civilization capable of such transmissions recorded long before Jor's great-grandparents had drawn breath. To stand before an unrecorded one was to stand before the failure of the Empire itself. Filter the transmissions, Jor commanded. The ship's linguistic engines began their work, chewing through static and noise. At first, only garbled fragments spilled into the deck, but slowly the chaos shaped itself into words the crew could understand. Voices cascaded through the speakers, rapid, overlapping, alive. "Market closes higher today. Please turn that down. This is Earth Central. Good night. Breaking report. Unidentified craft sighted against the night sky." The crew froze. Not tribal chants, not war cries, not the formalized speech of a planetary senate. These were the voices of ordinary life, of a people too busy living to restrain themselves, and woven in between voices, acknowledging the strange lights above them. Their tone not fearful, but curious. "They know," Wren whispered, almost in disbelief. "They've seen us." The flotilla descended toward high orbit, the projection filled with the image of the world, oceans vast and blue, continents painted with green and desert gold, storms curling like silver ribbons, and on the darkened hemisphere, constellations of artificial light glittering in sprawling webs. Aircraft traced white scars through the atmosphere. Satellites wheeled above, their signals humming. Humanity had not waited for the Empire. It had already filled its skies. "Population in the billions," Yill reported, her voice unsteady. "Fragmented into multiple nations, languages, dozens, hundreds. Political divisions evident. No sign of unity, but technology." She swallowed. "Advanced in communication, computation, and industry. They lack jump drives, but their skies are full. They are fractured, yet relentless." Wren shook his head. "Chaos. They contradict themselves at every turn. Yet they thrive," Yill murmured. Jor did not answer. His training urged him to frame what he saw within doctrine. Fractured civilizations collapsed under their own weight, and primitives bent under the Empire's heel. But what filled the void around him was neither collapse nor submission. It was noise, it was laughter, it was stubborn life, refusing to conform to the Empire's order. Protocol demanded the next step. The vigilant thought opened its combs, broadcasting the Empire's greeting. 3 pure tones resonated across the spectrum, followed by the sigil encoded in mathematical inevitability. The greeting was a declaration, a promise, a threat. You are seen, and to resist is useless. The crew waited. The planet spun below, its chaos uninterrupted. Voices carried on heedlessly commerce, art, arguments, songs. For a heartbeat it seemed Earth had not heard. Then, slicing through the static, On a narrow radio band, a voice answered. It was unguarded, translated instantly rough with amusement. "Hi, whoever you are, you're not in our records either." The voice laughed, light, careless, utterly unlike the scripted fear or reverence the crew had been trained to expect. Ren stiffened, his face dark with disbelief. "They mocked us." Yill's eyes widened as her console confirmed the translation. "Captain, they recognized the structure of our handshake." They understood Atan chose to laugh. Jor felt the silence press against him. For all his years of service, for all the simulations and doctrines burned into his mind, nothing had prepared him for this. An unrecorded homeworld, billions, strong, fractured, yet unafraid, answering inevitability with humor. He stared at the blue and green sphere turning beneath them and, for the first time, felt the certainty of empire erode. Far away, in the Hall of Certainty, the Atlas rejected another attempt to assign a designation. The blind notation remained, blank and anchored. On Earth's surface, a radio host replayed the strange alien signal to an amused audience, dismissing it as a prank. And aboard the Vigilant Thought, Captain Jor spoke words not found in any protocol, words that chilled his crew more than silence ever could. They watched the blue world swing beneath them, while the translators learned its noise. And within an hour, the signals aimed at the flotilla shifted from amused curiosity to crisp formality. The Empire expected a single voice to claim ownership. And obedience. Earth gave them a chorus that negotiated with itself in real time. An international response net coalesced out of competing agencies, science academies, militaries, and broadcasters. A woman with a steady voice and tired eyes became their anchor, speaking on a channel the Vigilant Thought could hear. She identified herself as Liaison Director Sora Melik and did not bother with obeisance. She asked for verification, for reciprocity, for rules. She said the word transparency as if it were a shield and a flag. Captain Jor held to protocol and offered the Empire's credentials, the seal of the Admiralty, the axiom of certainty, the declaration that their presence conferred order. He expected the list to settle the matter. Instead, Malik asked for 3 things the Empire never gave. On first contact, a mutual exchange of identifiers down to ship registry numbers, a delay to allow translation to be audited by independent human teams, and the right to broadcast any conversation lived to the planet's population. She explained evenly that Earth did not grant unobserved power to strangers. However, Advanced.jor muted the channel long enough to feel his jaw work. Ren bristled beside him, eager for the simplicity of dominance. Ensign Yill kept her hands still by force of will alone. On a narrow, secure band, the voice of Prefect Saratal reached them from Archivum Prime with ice-smooth clarity. Proceed, but do not surrender narrative control. Establish hierarchy without overt threat. The Empire's face must remain a mirror that shows calm. He reopened the channel and shaped his words with care. Live broadcast was denied. The Empire did not perform negotiations for an audience. He proposed a closed session between authorized representatives on a secure frequency, recorded for posterity. Malik considered, then replied that posterity was watching now, and that secrets were corrosive in moments like these. He could hear voices behind her, rapid and overlapping, people arguing, advising, translating, joking. Humanity was still speaking. To itself, while it spoke to him. Then choose a smaller truth, she said at last. Your name, your ship, your intent. Say them plainly, and we will answer in kind. He gave them. Captain Jor of the Courier, Vigilant Thought. Escorting the frigate's rime of iron and prerogative, dispatched to investigate an unindexed signal. He left out the sentence the axiom wanted him to add. Your world is now seen, therefore, it will be ruled. Malik returned her own. She was speaking from a coordination center in Geneva. Her committee included scientists from Lagos, Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Auckland. Her military colleagues were coordinating airspace and orbital safety. Her intent was to prevent panic and avoid unnecessary escalation. Another voice cut in, mildly humorous, to add and to keep our pilots from doing anything stupid, which drew a brief ripple of laughter on the human channel that made Yill glance up, surprised by the warmth of it. The flotilla's sensors lit with active pings from below as radar arrays painted their hulls and optical scopes tracked their silhouettes. A flight of human jets clawed up out of atmosphere, contrails thin and frail compared to the frigate's grim mass. They formed tidy triangles and took station on the Imperial formation's lower arc, respectful of physics, bristling with weapons that would amount to be stings against capital armor. Their pilots spoke with disciplined cheer, requesting identification, and flight plans in accents the translator rendered into neutral cadence. Wren scoffed under his breath until one of the jets executed a knife-edge roll that put its canopy level with the Rime of Iron's sensor blister for the sheer audacity of it. The pilot waved. Wren forgot to finish his scoff. "Not primitives," Yill murmured. "They've practiced meeting threats bigger than themselves." The first true test came when Malik proposed the venue for meeting. Earth wanted the aliens to come down not to palaces or cathedrals, but to a desert salt flat hastily refitted with a cordon, medical tents, and a swarm of cameras on long booms. The Empire never met under the open sky on someone else's terms. The protocol demanded a controlled bay aboard a ship, all angles and guards in air you could trust. Jor asked for orbital parley instead, offering to retrieve a delegation to the Vigilant Thought. A murmur ran behind Malik's voice. When it cleared, she said that any representative who left the ground would be accused of treason by conspiracy theorists before they landed. Better to plant feet on soil and be seen. "It is not our custom," Jor said. "It isn't ours either," Malik said, not unkindly, "but we make do." He cut transmission again and requested instructions. The Hall of Certainty returned, with doctrine disguised as advice. Demonstrations of strength without the theater of cruelty. No landing until airspace was sterilized. No concessions that imply parity. Jor weighed doctrine against the white, stubborn noise of the planet below and made a choice that would be called deviation later, if it went badly, and prudence if it went well. He told Malik he would send an unarmed shuttle with 3 envoys, and that the frigates would hold position in a high, inert orbit. He required a clear corridor and a guarantee of safety. Malik replied that humanity was unreliable, but not faithless. They would do everything in their power to keep his people alive. The shuttle bay opened like a pupil widening. The chosen craft was a soft-edged ovoid, its plating dulled and its transponder set to scream diplomacy in all directions. Jor watched the 3 envoys board, a linguist with a voice like a flute, a cultural analyst whose files were full of dead empires, and Commander Havel, security in name and conscience. Havel wore no visible weapon, but moved like a blade, learning to be a spoon. Jor told them to speak no threat, to promise nothing, to listen more than they spoke. Yill whispered a blessing she did not admit to believing as the shuttle slid free, and angled its belly toward the atmosphere. Descent revealed the planet's textures in quick succession. A seam of cloud-like torn silk, a bruised blue shadow of a mountain chain, a stretch of dun desert wrinkled by winds. Human airspace control did not sterilize the sky. It choreographed it. Drones rose in paired curls to define a corridor. The fighter escorts broke off and reformed to create a living boundary. Civilian craft were diverted with apologies and a carnival of flashing advisories. On a wide white basin that reflected sun into the shuttle's windows, a ring of vehicles formed an improvised perimeter. Tens of thousands watched from screens and rooflines, and feeds piped into kitchen tables. The Empire never invited witnesses. Earth arrived with all of them. The shuttle settled on its skids. Heat shimmered. Dust smelled like salt and old rain. The ramp descended and gave the envoys their first breath of human air, layered with engine, temps, and dry sunlight. A line of people waited beyond the cordon. They were dressed without uniformity, suits beside lab coats, beside flight suits, beside a woman in a bright patterned jacket that stubbornly refused to be overshadowed by the moment. Director Sora Malik stepped forward. Her hair had escaped its tie. Her eyes looked like she had been awake for days, but refused to let that matter. She lifted a hand, not to bless or command, but to greet. The linguist spoke first. Voice low and shaped by endless drills, he offered formal salutations in imperial cadence. Then, in the halting approximation of several human languages, the translator had scraped together. Malik listened without flinching, then answered in the Empire's tongue with an accent that made the vowels tilt. She thanked them for coming unarmed and under observation. She announced that the meeting was recorded and that every word could be audited later. She avoided calling the visitors guests or invaders. She said they were neighbors, however badly the maps handled it. Havel's eyes moved constantly, measuring angles and distances, mapping threats the way a carpenter measures a frame. He saw snipers on the rim with barrels pointed away, not at a gesture of respect he filed away and did not mention. He saw medics with kits and portable scanners, a concession to biology. He saw a child on a father's shoulders, far beyond the cordon, holding a sign hand-painted in quick strokes that the translator turned into welcome. Next to it, another sign read, "Not in our records either," and Havel's mouth almost moved. The first human demand was small and enormous. A young engineer with flying goggles pushed up on his head asked, with awful politeness, if the visiting shuttle's sensor logs of descent could be shared for scientific calibration. The Empire guarded raw sensor feeds the way it guarded succession lists. The linguist hesitated and glanced at Havel, who glanced at the sky where the vigilant thought hung as a bright insect against day. Jor's voice whispered in his ear, "Deny. Offer a summary later." The linguist complied. The engineer nodded, disappointed without sulking, and moved on to the next question with the quick resilience of someone used to knows. The first human joke in the dust was older than radio. A pilot in a flight suit asked, deadpan, if the visitors wished to be taken to their leader. Laughter rolled in a wave around the ring. Even Malik smiled, and Havel felt the room breathe out. The linguist, to his credit, did not miss his cue. He replied that their leader was too far for a short walk, and that Earth had several. If rumors were true, the laughter became warmer. The ground shifted a little closer to level. Beneath the surface of civility ran the hard braid of caution. Human technicians circled the shuttle with handheld sniffers that sang quietly to themselves, checking for radiation, pathogens, microdevices, security drones perched like patient birds on thin tripods, lenses unblinking. A negotiator with a lawyer's cadence asked about jurisdiction, about what the Empire meant when it said it saw. Malik asked what would happen to smaller nations if a larger one offered collaboration. The cultural analyst answered carefully. The Empire did not recognize internal divisions once a world entered its scope. He felt the air cooled by a degree, and knew the sentence would echo through 1,000 human debate halls by nightfall. Up in orbit, Wren watched the live feeds, despite himself as human broadcasters split their screens into quadrants. Shuttle on the salt, jets in formation, diagrams of alien hull shapes. A panel of experts arguing about whether the 3 tones of the greeting formed a major chord. Memes proliferated like coral. Someone auto-tuned the handshake into a song that climbed the charts before the meeting reached its midpoint. A historian compared the Empire's sigil to an ancient seal and was wrong in an interesting way that traveled further than the correction. Yule found herself smiling at a clip of 2 children using pots and pans to clink out the alien tones. Wren scowled and watched it twice. What surprised Jor most, listening through Havel's feed, was speed. Humans moved through understanding like fire through dry grass. By the second hour, independent teams had published open-source translators that rivaled the Empire's first-generation models. By the third, a coalition of labs proposed a signal hygiene protocol to reduce interference with the flotilla's systems, and pilots across 3 air forces had adopted it without waiting for orders. They swarmed with arguments, but when a good idea landed, it spread like a rumor that helped you survive. As sunset leaned copper against the salt, Malik made the ask Jor had expected and dreaded. She wanted a limited exchange of materials, a set of non-invasive samples, air from the shuttle, data on benign environmental exposures, a harmless sensor ping from the frigate's outermost plates. In return, Earth would share full transparency. On human biosafety measures, a copy of the improved translation corpus and the flight telemetry of every jet that had escorted the shuttle. "Trust is expensive," she said, "so we can pay in small coins." The linguist looked to Havel, and Havel, breaking his own earlier advice, spoke into the mic to Jor, not as a request, but as a case. The coins were small. The audience was everyone. Refusing would buy the Empire nothing except the story that it feared a breath and a touch. Jor had lived his life by stories that closed doors. He was old enough to know the cost. He approved the exchange with limits that would make Sarah wince. The samples were taken like vials of dawn by full dark. The shuttle lifted and returned to orbit under its escort of human jets that flashed lights in a pattern. Someone later claimed spelled out goodnight in an old code. Wren declared the claim absurd. Yield quietly ran the pattern and found it matched. In the Hall of Certainty, the new entry waited to be named and refused, stubborn as a smile. Admiral Varan read the preliminary reports and could not, fit them into familiar boxers. At his balcony, he ordered larger ships readied with the tone of a man who suspects weight will be needed and hopes he is wrong. On the vigilant thought, after debriefing his envoys until the words blurred, Jor shut the channel and stood alone. In a small room that the architects had meant for prayer and officers had repurposed for lists, he thought about a pilot waving at a gun bigger than his home, about a crowd insisting on seeing, about a liaison who used the word neighbor in a universe that preferred subjects and enemies. He thought about an empire that had never learned to say please because it had never needed to, and about a world that had turned a threat into a song before dinner. The Hall of Certainty did not sleep, but it knew the rhythm of its own cycles. Scholars and architects came and went like tides, maintaining the endless architecture of knowledge that underpinned the Empire's grip on the stars. Normally, the system hummed with the quiet arrogance of perfection. Entries streaming in, categories expanding, every fact pinned into place with the calm of inevitability. But now, deep within the lower stacks, a wound pulsed. The blind notation resisted every attempt to be sealed with a name, and that failure spread whispers through the ranks like cracks in glass. Admiral Varone stood again upon his balcony, his hands folded behind his back, watching the architects circle in ritual motions that had steadied him for decades. Yet today, their patterns looked less like ritual and more like a frantic dance. Reports had arrived from the Vigilant Thought detailing the discovery of Earth and the initial exchanges. They spoke of multiple languages, multiple governments, a civilization fractured yet somehow cohesive. They spoke of laughter in the face of the Empire's greeting. And worse, they spoke of a refusal to fit into any category the Atlas provided. He turned to Prefect Saratal, who waited with a slate brimming with fresh attempts at classification. "Tell me what the archives have found." She shook her head, a gesture too sharp for someone usually composed. "We scoured every age, Admiral. Myths, apocrypha, corrupted entries, even discarded footnotes from dead scholars. There are scattered mentions of bipeds resembling them, creatures of flesh, who spread quickly, fought savagely, built clumsy machines. But every reference contradicts. The next, in one era, they are extinct, in another, enslaved, in a third, mythologized, never consistent, never verifiable. The system dismisses them as noise. Noise does not laugh back at you," Farron said coldly. Sira's jaw tightened. "No, it does not. And so the Atlas refuses to give them a designator. Every time we attempt to fix them to a name, the structure collapses. It is as though they were never here, and yet they are." Varen looked down upon the endless shelves of light and glass, and for the first time in decades, he saw not order, but fragility. The Empire's strength had always been certainty. It's what happened when certainty cracked. In distant systems, news of the anomaly spread despite censorship. Sailors whispered in mess halls about an uncharted world that mocked the Empire. Subjugated species passed rumors through hidden channels, eyes alight with a dangerous glimmer of hope. The Empire had always insisted its knowledge was infinite, but here was proof of ignorance, and ignorance was contagious. On the Vigilant Thought, Captain Jor sat alone in his quarters, replaying the transmission of the human voice, casual, amused, irreverent. He had faced rebel admirals and zealot kings, and none had unnerved him as deeply as that laughter. Reports piled on his desks answer readings, linguistics updates, cultural analyses, but every page seemed thinner than it should have been. For every answer, there were 10 new contradictions. The humans were fractured yet coordinated, primitive yet clever, ignorant yet bold. They were not supposed to exist, and yet they filled the skies of their world, looking upward without fear. Jor summoned Ensign Yill and Lieutenant Wren. Yill's eyes shone with something dangerously close to admiration, Wren's with barely disguised contempt. "We must submit our preliminary analysis," Jor said. The Admiralty will demand certainty. We must give them something. Certainty, Ren scoffed. They are primitives who got lucky. Their world is noisy, chaotic, undisciplined. A dozen fleets could reduce them to ash, and yet they damaged one of our probes with weapons cobbled together from Stone Age rocketry. Yiel countered sharply. They adapt, they improvise, they laugh. That is not luck. That is resilience, Ren sneered. Resilience is nothing against doctrine, against mathematics. Mathematics predicted they did not exist, Yiel shot back. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Across the Empire, ministers debated behind closed doors. Some called for immediate conquest to smother the embarrassment before it spread. Others urged caution, warning that to crush humanity too quickly might only confirm the Empire's weakness. For the first time in living memory, the question was not how to rule, but whether their claim to inevitability could withstand a people who should not exist in the Hall of Certainty. The Atlas continued to reject every attempt to anchor the blind notation. On the surface of Earth, late-night comedians mocked the Empire's three-tone greeting, while children in playgrounds mimicked alien words with laughter. And in quiet corners of conquered worlds, slaves whispered a phrase that would echo for years if the Empire did not know them. Perhaps the Empire does not know everything. Varen stared at the shimmering wound in the records and spoke the truth. Aloud, though only Sarah heard him. Our certainty has failed us, and when certainty fails, empires burn. On the night side of Earth, where continents glittered like necklaces of fire, the Imperial frigate Rime of Iron drifted in orbit with her sister ships. Captain Jor stood at his dais, reviewing the Admiralty's latest directive. It was not veiled in diplomacy. The order was escalation, a demonstration of superiority, sharp and decisive. To remind humanity that curiosity was not consent and laughter was not immunity, the command reached him in a single sentence encoded with the Empire's most uncompromising seal: exemplify dominance. Deter insolence. Break nothing essential. He read it twice, then let the slate dim. To break nothing essential implied there was already value in the world below. That implication was enough to trouble him more than the order itself. The Empire did not usually bother with qualifiers. Lieutenant Wren was eager the moment he heard at last permission to show them what inevitability feels like. His eyes gleamed as though he'd been waiting for this moment since the first human voice had dared to laugh. Ensign Yiel sat stiff at her console, refusing to meet his gaze. Captain, may I remind you of the response teams on the surface? The humans have already adapted their translation systems, and their militaries are active. If we provoke them, they can do nothing, Wren interrupted. Their jets are toys, their rocket stones hurled into the dark. Let us crush one installation, silence a continent's worth of signals. They'll kneel, they won't kneel, Yiel whispered. They'll fight. Jor raised a hand, silencing both. He had already decided how to enact the order. A single warship would descend into low orbit and fire a precision strike against a military target non-nuclear, a blow the humans could neither stop nor misunderstand. He chose a coastal naval installation, its radar arrays already probing their ships with crude, insistent beams. At dawn, the Rime of Iron dipped lower, her hull cutting through the upper atmosphere like a dark star. Sensors painted the installation in flawless resolution: concrete, piers, steel hangars, warships bobbing in gray water. Wren oversaw the firing sequence, his voice clipped with anticipation. Plasma lance charged. Target locked. On your mark, Captain. Jor gave the word. The lance carved the sky with silent light, a spear of burning energy that punched through the naval yard's central tower and split it like wet paper. Fire blossomed outward, sirens shrieked across the harbor, and a column of smoke twisted into the morning air. The humans had seconds to witness inevitability made flesh, and then they answered. The first salvo came not from ships, but from the shore. Dozens of missiles streaked upward, their trails white against the rising sun. They should have been irrelevant dumb warheads without the speed or guidance to touch Imperial armor, but halfway through ascent, they split. Each missile disgorged clusters of smaller drones, wings unfolding, engines flaring. They swarmed like hornets, weaving through plasma bursts and counterfire. Jamming targeting systems with chaotic signals. Wren barked commands, his composure fraying. Point defense online. Clear the sky. Turrets spat lines of fire, cutting swaths through the swarm. But for every drone that burst into flame, 3 more slipped through. One slammed into the frigate's port plating, its warhead crude but vicious. The ship shuddered. Damage reports cascaded across Wren's console. Impossible, he hissed. They're improvising mid-flight adapting. From the sea, human warships launched another volley, mixing decoys with live missiles, forcing the frigate's defenses to waste firepower. From the shore, batteries of ungainly railguns spat slugs upward, their trajectories unpredictable, guided by nothing but stubborn physics and human intuition. One slug grazed the hull, gouging a scar that sensors screamed about. Ensign voice cut through the chaos. Captain, they're not aiming for kills. They're probing us, testing defenses, learning in real time. Jor knew she was right. Each strike was smarter than the last. The humans were not playing by rules the Empire had written. They were writing new ones as they fought. He ordered a retreat, the words sour in his mouth. The rime of iron clawed back into higher orbit, trailing smoke from 2 wounded sections. The naval yard below burned, but it still lived, and in its ruins humans scrambled like ants, already salvaging, already preparing for the next round. On the human broadcasts, images of the burning frigate flooded screens. Crowds gathered in cities, not weeping in fear, but roaring with triumph. Commentators shouted, scientists speculated, children pointed skyward with eyes full of fire. Humanity had faced the Empire's first blow and survived, and in surviving, they had drawn blood. Back aboard the Vigilant Thought, Jor faced his officers. Wren sat pale and rigid, his arrogance cracked. Yill's hands trembled, but her eyes shone with something close to awe. They should have broken, Wren muttered. They should have scattered. They won't break, Yill said. They'll keep learning. Every strike we make, they'll answer with 10 more questions, and 10 more tricks. Jor said nothing. He turned his gaze toward the planet below, its cities still glowing defiantly against the dark. He thought of the Empire's axiom. If it exists, we have recorded it. If we have recorded it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can rule it. And he realized, with a cold clarity that chilled him to the bone, that humanity had just broken the chain. The Hall of Certainty had always been a cathedral of calm. Its architects moved like dancers, their robes whispering through the corridors as they inscribed the universe into perfect order. But since the engagement at Earth.com had become performance, the blind notation pulsed like a bruise on the atlas, refusing to be bound by name or number. And now, for the first time in living memory, a report arrived from the front that did not end with the word victory. Admiral Varan read the dispatch. Twice, the rime of iron had limped home with scorched plating, its point defense turrets crippled, its crew shaken by improvised weapons that should never have touched them. The humans had taken the blow meant to cow them and turned it into a rallying cry. Broadcasts of the burning frigate played endlessly across their networks, spliced with laughter, defiance, and music that made no sense to Imperial ears. Sarah Tal stood at his side, her slate overflowing with intercepted fragments. They are not denying the damage, they're celebrating it. Songs, images, crude animations, mocking us. And worse, she flicked her fingers and the slate filled with new headlines. Other worlds are listening, whispers spreading through our subject systems. The Empire's mask has cracked. Baron closed his eyes briefly. Empires did not bleed. Empires did not falter, yet this wound was spreading faster than fire. Have they discovered how to pierce our armor? No, Admiral, not in the way our enemies have tried before. They exploit weaknesses we didn't know existed. Improvise signals that confuse our targeting. Kinetic strikes launched at odd angles, timed with instinct, not calculation. Their weapons should be harmless, but in their hands, she shook. Her head, they are something else. Varen's gaze dropped to the glowing wound in the atlas. He thought of the axiom. If it exists, we have recorded it. If we have recorded it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can rule it. But what if prediction failed? What if existence itself refused to be caged? On Earth, humanity celebrated with ragged pride. The naval yard burned, but it was still standing, and already welders were at work, hammering twisted steel into shape. The world watched the sky, not with fear, but with stubborn resolve. News anchors debated tactics. Amateur engineers proposed new weapons live on air. Hackers bragged about probing Imperial signals, turning chaos into sabotage. The Empire had meant to frighten them into silence. Instead, it had given them a common enemy. Aboard the Vigilant Thought, Captain Jor convened his officers in the dim light of the strategy chamber. Ren's face was pale, his arrogance burned away by humiliation. "They should have been crushed," he muttered. "No fractured species survives contact with us. They should have begged." Yill's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "They won't beg. Every strike we make, they learn. Every failure becomes fuel. They laugh in our faces and still find ways to wound us. This is not weakness. This is adaptation." Jor looked between them, weighing their words like stones in his palms. He had lived his life by certainty, by doctrine, by the promise that knowledge was control. But the humans had shattered that promise. They were unpredictable, irreverent, and utterly unafraid. And that made them dangerous in a way no armada had ever been. In the weeks that followed, chaos rippled across the Empire. Supply routes faltered under unexpected interference. Fleets reported strange disruptions, navigation beacons failing, communications scrambled, systems overloaded with signals that carried fragments of human noise. Some officers dismissed them as coincidences. Others whispered of sabotage. The truth was worse. Humanity had begun to reach into the Empire's networks. With crude, desperate hand-sand sometimes, those hands found leverage. On conquered worlds, whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into shouts. If the Empire could bleed, perhaps it could break. And if an unrecorded people could strike its fleets, perhaps others could rise again. The very illusion of inevitability, more powerful than any weapon, was crumbling. Vern stood once more on his balcony, staring at the fracture in the atlas that no architect could mend. Around him, the Hall of Certainty moved with forced composure, as though ritual could hide the smell of fear. "Our certainty is collapsing," he said softly, to no one in particular. "And certainty was our rule." The words were not meant to escape his lips, but they did, and once spoken they could not be unsaid. On the edges of the spur, where Imperial maps had always been blank beyond their carefully drawn lanes, new signals began to appear. Not Imperial relays, not the clean lattice of the courier guilds, but flickers and bursts of human origin. At first, the Admiralty dismissed them as noise. Then, a supply convoy failed to report in, then another, and another. When scouts were dispatched, they found the hulks of freighters drifting in silence, cargo bays gutted, crew missing. Carved into one hull with acid and fire was a message in jagged letters that took the Empire's translators a moment to catch. "We learn fast." Captain Jor read the report in the dim light of his ready room. His fingers tightened on the slate until it creaked. Humanity had begun to strike beyond their world, scavenging weapons from ruins, salvaging fragments of Imperial wreckage, and weaving them into improvised fleets. Small, ugly ships bristling with stolen plating and jury-rigged engines appeared where no record said they should. They did not fight like the Empire's enemies were supposed to. They hit from shadows, melted into asteroid fields, or hid behind the electromagnetic storms of gas giants. They did not care for lines of battle. They cared only for survival, and survival made them. Inventive, the first time a human raiding craft detonated an asteroid into a spray of fragments that tore through an Imperial patrol. Ren had called it luck. The second time, Yill had pointed out that the fragments had been seeded with metal slivers tuned to blind sensors. The third time, Jor had stopped calling it anything but deliberate. Reports flowed in faster than the Hall of Certainty could sanitize. A relay station gutted by explosives hidden in its coolant vents. A frigate forced to flee when a swarm of drones overloaded its shields with sheer noise before detonating themselves in suicide arcs. Outposts on the periphery finding their communications jammed by looping human signals, laughter music, gibberish that made discipline crackle with unease. On Earth, unity grew from chaos. The governments that had once snarled at each other now poured resources into shared arsenals. Nations with histories of war sat at the same tables, bound together by the knowledge that something vast and arrogant had tried to erase them. Fleet took shapefighters with new alloys ripped from crashed Imperial debris, missiles guided by stolen code, mining ships converted into battering rams. Every success brought more volunteers, more daring ideas, more resolve on orbit above Mars. A coalition of human engineers unveiled their most audacious invention, a weaponized rail cannon carved from the bones of an asteroid mining rig. It fired crude rods of iron wrapped in improvised guidance thrusters, but its range and kinetic power rivaled anything the Empire expected from a primitive race. The first time it fired, it smashed through the plating of a scout ship before the Imperial captain even realized he was in range. The humans named it Zeus, not for reverence, but for mockery. Admiral Varan received these reports in silence. He had built his life on the Empire's axiom, and now he watched it erode with every dispatch. The Atlas rejected human entries, refusing to bind them to certainty, and the gap widened daily. The whispers across subjugated worlds grew louder. Entire cultures, long cowed into obedience, began to wonder if the humans were a spark worth following. Captain Jor sat with his officers in the vigilant thoughts chamber, the hum of damaged systems filling the silence. Ren argued for escalation, for a full fleet to be dispatched to burn Earth to ash. Yil countered that such a strike would not end the threat, only ignite rebellion across the Empire. Humanity had proven they could not be crushed with a single blow. They do not fight for dominance, she said. They fight because they cannot stop. Every defeat makes them sharper. Every loss they turn into a weapon. That is what makes them dangerous. Jor listened, his silence more eloquent than their words. He thought of the laughing voice that had answered their first greeting, of the pilot who had waved at a ship larger than his city, of the swarm of drones that had sacrificed themselves not to win, but to teach. Humanity was not playing by the Empire's rules. Humanity was writing new ones in blood and fire, and somewhere in the black between stars, a flotilla of human raiders painted a crude emblem on the side of a stolen shuttle, a circle of stars, broken open by a jagged line. They had no word for inevitability, but they had a word for defiance, and soon the Empire would learn it in every tongue Earth could muster. Fear seeped into the Empire, not with a roar, but with whispers. In the markets of Archivum Prime, traders passed rumors beneath their breath, glancing over their shoulders before speaking of an unrecorded world that had bloodied Imperial steel. On subjugated colonies, once silent slaves murmured new prayers that ended not with the Empire's name, but with Earth's. Even in the war colleges, where certainty was drilled as ruthlessly as mathematics, cadets traded fragments of intercepted human broadcasts, songs, jokes, fragments of speeches that burned with a kind of reckless hope. Admiral Varan read reports of riots breaking out on distant planets, sparked by nothing more than word of the humans' defiance. Statues of emperors were defaced overnight, their faces scrawled over with crude human slogans. Entire sectors now required double the garrisons to hold them quiet. Certainty had always been the Empire's greatest weapon. Now, cracks in certainty spread faster than fleets could travel. In the Hall of Certainty, the architects worked themselves ragged, trying to tame the anomaly. The Atlas rejected every designation attempt, throwing up errors that should have been impossible. Some architects whispered of corruption in the code. Others, more daring, suggested that the Atlas itself refused to lie. Whatever the reason, Earth remained unbound, and the wound in the archives widened until even the most faithful scholars began to doubt. On the vigilant thought, Captain Jor felt the change in the very air his crew breathed. Once his officers had spoken with unshakable confidence. Now he heard unease in their voices, saw hesitation in their eyes. Ren grew angrier by the day, snapping at subordinates, demanding more aggression, as if fury could restore order. Yil, by contrast, grew quiet, her reports precise but edged with something that looked dangerously like admiration for their enemy. Jor found himself caught between them, haunted by the laughter of that first human voice. Beyond Earth, human raids grew bolder. They struck at relay stations, slicing apart the Empire's communications web. They hijacked transports, flooding subjugated planets with recordings of their defiance. Their pilots flew ships that should never have survived, yet did, because no doctrine had prepared for their unpredictability. With every success, the legend grew, a people from nowhere, unrecorded, unbroken, daring to defy inevitability itself. The Empire tried to censor the stories, but suppression only made them spread faster. On border worlds, graffiti bloomed on walls, rough sketches of a blue planet with words scrawled beneath in dozens of tongues. On conquered worlds, elders told children that the Empire could be resisted because humans had done so. And among the Empire's own citizens, who had long accepted certainty as the price of peace, a dangerous thought took root. Perhaps certainty was a lie. Admiral Varone stood once more on his balcony, watching the light of the Atlas stutter and shimmer. "They have given us something worse than defeat," he murmured to Saratal. "They have given us doubt." And across the stars, in the heart of a crowded human city, a child lifted her eyes to the night sky, pointed at the faint glimmer of an Imperial frigate, and laughed. That laughter, carried through broadcasts and whispers, would ripple further than any fleet. The Empire had always ruled with inevitability. Now inevitability itself was breaking. The fleets gathered in silence beyond the orbit of Saturn, their hulls glinting in the pale sunlight. Hundreds of Imperial warships, an armada assembled not only to conquer, but to erase humiliation. They stretched across the void in precise formation, their weapons charged, their databanks stuffed with every scrap of intelligence the Empire could scrape together on humanity. Admirals spoke of inevitability, of restoring order, of crushing. The myth before it consumed the Empire itself. Yet behind their measured words lurked something they had not known in centuries. Fear, at the heart of the Armada, the vigilant thought, held position. Captain Jor stood at his dais, expression unreadable, as his crew prepared for what doctrine declared a foregone conclusion. Lieutenant Wren moved with brittle efficiency, his hunger for revenge barely restrained. Ensign Yill worked quietly, her fingers dancing across her console, but her eyes betrayed unease. They had seen enough of humanity to know this battle would not unfold as the archives predicted. Earth's response came swiftly. The skies over Sol filled with ships that looked like patchwork, ugly and improvised, yet alive with defiance, converted. Freighters bristling with railguns, mining rigs strapped with missile pods. Fighters cobbled from alloys, torn from Rexall, crewed by men and women who had sworn survival mattered more than Polish. They were outnumbered 100 to 1, outgunned by magnitudes, yet their formations carried a kind of reckless grace. They did not move like a single navy. They moved like thousands of minds, sparking in chaotic harmony. The battle began with mathematics. Imperial dreadnoughts opened fire in perfect sequence, plasma lances cutting arcs through the dark. Human ships should have shattered in moments, but instead, the beams met clouds of debris, drones, and shattered asteroids detonated. In their path, the humans had seeded the battlefield itself with traps, Imperial targeting systems, trained on clean patterns, choked on the noise. Then the improvisation began. Human pilots dove their ships through asteroid belts at suicidal speeds, forcing Imperial cruisers to follow or lose their quarry. Mining RIGS launched volleys of iron rods wrapped in improvised thrusters, each one guided not by algorithms but by human instinct. Some missed entirely, others tore holes through holes that doctrine swore were invulnerable. Wren barked orders, his voice cracking with disbelief. Their tactics make no sense. Why? Aren't they breaking? Why don't they retreat? Because retreat was never part of their plan, Yill said softly. Every death teaches them. Every failure sharpens them. They don't fear loss, Lieutenant. They use it. The Empire's formations began to fracture. Ships collided in the chaos, their perfect symmetry undone by unpredictability. Human cyber attacks flooded comes with laughter, music, and fragments of speeches that rattled even the most disciplined crews. A destroyer's targeting array froze as its systems looped the same human phrase again and again. We are here. We are here. We are here. JOR. Watched in silence as Imperial dreadnoughts fell one by one, undone not by superior firepower, but by ingenuity. A swarm of kamikaze drones rammed the rime of iron, still scarred from its last encounter, and detonated. With such force that the frigate split in half. From the wreckage, humans scavenged components even as the battle raged on. Turning debris into weapons mid-fight, the decisive moment came when the humans unleashed their hidden weapon, Zeus. The massive rail cannon, built from a mining rig and hidden within the asteroid belt, fired a tungsten rod the size of a shuttle. It tore through the shields of an Imperial battleship and punched clean through its core. The explosion lit the void, and for the first time, an Imperial flagship fell to a species the Atlas insisted did not exist. The Armada broke. Not all at once, not in panic, but with the slow, terrible realization that no amount of doctrine could contain this chaos. Orders dissolved into confusion. Ships scattered, retreating toward the outer system. Their captains desperate to escape the madness of a battle that refused to follow the rules. Asterisk on Earth. Billions watched through broadcasts. As Imperial ships burned in the void, they did not cheer quietly, they roared. Children painted stars on their faces. Soldiers raised their fists. Leaders who had once bickered stood side by side, their arguments drowned by unity. Humanity had faced the greatest empire in the galaxy, and instead of breaking, they had bent the empire until it snapped in the Hall of Certainty. The architects wept as the Atlas flickered and failed to categorize the defeat. The blind notation pulsed larger than ever, no longer a wound, but a void swallowing the Empire's pretense of inevitability. Sarotal whispered that the humans had shattered pride itself, and Varen had no answer. Aboard the Vigilant Thought, Captain Jor stood in silence, watching Earth's blue curve gleam against the dark. He thought of the axiom that had guided his life, and he knew now it was a lie. Humanity had proven it false. They could not be recorded, predicted, or ruled. They could only be fatanned. Even in defeat, they would laugh. The shattered remnants of the Imperial fleet limped away from Sol, their formation broken, their disciplines scattered like ash in the wind. The humans did not pursue them with grand fleets or ceremonial triumph. They simply let the Empire retreat. Bloodied and beaten, their skies still defiantly alive with ships that by all rights should not have survived. The Empire had brought inevitability to Solend. Inevitability had burned. On Earth, the celebrations spread like wildfire. Cities lit their skylines in blazing color. Children painted the sigil of the shattered empire, crossed out with bold strokes. Broadcasts replayed footage of Imperial dreadnoughts torn apart by improvised weapons, of the massive rail cannon Zeus firing its impossible shot, of pilots waving at Leviathans as they danced through debris fields. Humanity had always fought, among itself, divided by lines on maps and words in books. Now, for the first time in memory, it stood together beneath a single banner: survival. And victory, in the Hall of Certainty, silence reigned. The Atlas had not merely failed to categorize humanity, it had begun to rewrite itself in a desperate attempt to reconcile contradictions. Pages of light collapsed into blankness. Catalogs that had stood unchallenged for centuries flickered with doubt. The architects moved like mourners, their rituals sluggish, their faces pale with the knowledge that their god of knowledge had been wounded beyond repair. Admiral Varone, his fleets had been undone not by power greater than theirs, but by a people who should never have existed. The axiom had failed. Certainty had failed. For the first time in living memory, the Empire would need to record its own ignorance. Sarotal stood beside him, her voice quiet. We told the galaxy we knew all things. Now they know we do not. Varen closed his eyes. He had spent his life believing in the weight of inevitability, in the Empire's right to rule, because it understood. But Earth had proven that understanding was not omniscience, that unpredictability was its own kind of power. We will have to rewrite, he said. His words felt heavy, like iron chains slipping free from a drowning man. The decree spread across the Empire. A new entry was added to the archives. For the first time, it was not triumphant, not a declaration of dominion, but a confession. The Atlas inscribed the words reluctantly, its light stuttering as it yielded humanity. Origin unknown, unrecorded, adaptable, dangerous. Unconquered worlds, hope ignited like fire in dry fields. Chains were tested, overseers defied, rebellions whispered back into being. The myth of inevitability had cracked, and through that crack poured a truth more powerful than fleets. The Empire could bleed. On Earth, humanity did not declare itself a conqueror. They patched their wounds, rebuilt their ships, and prepared for the next inevitable clash. They knew the Empire would return, but now they carried proof that even giants could stumble. They had carved their name into history, not with obedience, but with defiance. And so the story spread, not only through human mouths, but through the whispers of slaves and rebels and hidden dreamers, that from nowhere had come a people unafraid, who laughed at inevitability and struck down certainty. Itself in the Hall of Certainty, the axiom still glowed, but its words rang hollow. If it exists, we have recorded it. If we have recorded it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can rule it. Beneath it, in smaller script, burned the addition no one could erase, except humanity. The empire retreated into silence, its pride in ruins. Humanity stood bloodied, defiant, and unbroken, their laughter echoing across the stars. And in that laughter, the galaxy heard the first cracks of an empire's fall.